let's move to the modern day, and we'll return to history, maybe 67 and other important moments. But let's look to today, in the recent months, October 7th. Let me ask sort of a pointed question. Was October 7th attacks by Hamas on Israel genocidal? Was it an act of ethnic cleansing? Just so we lay out the moral calculus that we are engaged in. I don't. Maybe you was
The
sure.
problem with October 7th is this: the Hamas fighters who invaded southern Israel were ordered to murder, rape, and do all the nasty things that they did, and they killed some 1,200 Israelis that day, and abducted them, as we know, something like 250 civilians, mostly civilians, also some soldiers, took them back to Gaza, dungeons in Gaza. But they were motivated not just by the words of their current leader in the Gaza Strip, but by their ideology, which is embedded in their charter from 1988, if I remember correctly. And that charter is genocidal. It says that the Jews must be eradicated basically from the land of Israel, from Palestine. The Jews are described there as sons of apes and pigs. The Jews are a base people, killers of prophets, and they should not exist in Palestine. It doesn't say that they necessarily should be murdered all around the world, the Hamas charter, but certainly the Jews should be eliminated from Palestine. And this is the driving ideology behind the massacre of the Jews on October 7th, which brought down on the Gaza Strip, and I think with the intention by the Hamas of the Israeli counteroffensive, because they knew that that counteroffensive would result in many Palestinian dead, because the Hamas fighters and their weaponry and so on were embedded in the population in Gaza, and they hoped to benefit from this in the eyes of world public opinion as Israel chased these Hamas people and their ammunition dumps and so on, and killed lots of Palestinian civilians in the process. All of this was understood by Sinwar, by the head of the Hamas, and he strived for that. But initially, he wanted to kill as many Jews as he could in the border areas around the Gaza Strip.
I'll respond directly to the points you made, and then I'll leave it to Norm to bring in the historical context. That Hamas charter is from the 90s, I think.
1988.
1988, so it's from the 80s. I think your characterization of that charter as anti-Semitic is indisputable.
Okay.
I think your characterization of that charter as genocidal is off the mark.
It's implicit.
And more importantly, that charter has been superseded by a new charter. It, in fact, has been, well, there is
no new charter.
There is
an explanation, a statement they made in 2000 and something, 2018, supposedly clarifying things which are in the charter, but it doesn't actually step back from what the charter says. Eliminate Israel, eliminate the Jews from the land of Israel.
And in 2018, the Hamas charter, if we look at the current version of the charter,
it's not called a charter. You're calling it a charter. It wasn't. The only thing called the charter is what was issued in 1988 by Yassin himself.
Anyway, it makes a clear distinction between Jews and Zionists in 2018. Now, you can choose to dismiss it, believe it, it's sincere, it's insincere, whatever.
Insincere is probably the right word.
Secondly, I'm really unfamiliar with fighters who consult these kinds of documents before they go on.
Education system. In the kindergarten, they're told, kill the Jews. They practice with make-believe guns and uniforms when they're 5 years old in the kindergartens of the Hamas.
At the instruction of the Commissioner General of UNRWA, right?
I didn't say that. I said the Hamas has kindergartens and summer camps in which they train to kill Jews, children aged 5 and 6.
Secondly, you keep saying Jews, to which I would respond.
They use the word Jews.
To which I would respond that Hamas does not have a record of deliberately targeting Jews who are not Israelis. And in fact, it also doesn't have a record of deliberately targeting either Jews or Israelis outside Israel and Palestine. So, all this talk of...
unlike the Hezbollah, which has
Well,
targeted Jews outside Palestine.
we're talking about October 7th and Hamas. If you'd also like to speak about Hezbollah, let's get to that separately, if you don't mind. So again, genocidal. Well, if that term is going to be discussed, my first response would be, let's talk about potentially genocidal actions against Israelis rather than against Jews, for the reasons that I just mentioned. And again, I find this constant conflation of Jews, Israel, Zionism to be a bit disturbing. Secondly, I think there are quite a few indications in the factual record that raise serious questions about the accusations of the genocidal intent and genocidal practice of what happened on October 7th. And my final point would be, I don't think I should take your word for it. I don't think you should take my word for it. I think what we need here is a proper, independent, international investigation. And the reason we need that of genocide during this conflict, whether by Palestinians on October 7th or Israel thereafter. And the reason that we need such an investigation is because there won't be any hearings on what Hamas did on October 7th at the International Court of Justice, because the International Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide deals only with states and not with movements. I think the International Criminal Court, and specifically its current prosecutor, Karim Khan, lacks any and all credibility. He's been an absolute failure at his job. He's just been sitting on his backside for years on this file. And I think I would point out that Hamas has called for independent investigations of all these allegations. Israel has categorically rejected any international investigation, of course, fully supported by the United States. And I think what is required is to have credible investigations of these things, because I don't think you're going to convince me. I don't think I'm going to convince you. And this is two people sitting across the table from each other.
No, but there's certain things you don't even have to investigate. You know how many citizens, civilians died in the October 7th assault.
Yes, but that's not...
You know that there are lots of allegations of rape. I don't know how persuaded you are of those. They did find bodies without heads, which is
there were no beheadings
Islamic.
of infants.
There were some beheadings, apparently.
The Israelis didn't even claim that in the document they submitted before the ICJ. Go read what your government submitted. It never mentioned beheadings.
Well, as far as I know, there were some people who were beheaded.
Yeah.
But
we could bring it up right now.
You also deny that there were rapes there.
I didn't deny. I said I've not seen convincing evidence that confirms it. I've said that from day one, and I'll say it today, 4.5 months later.
Do you know that they killed 800 or 900 civilians in their assault?
Absolutely. Yes. That seems to me indisputable.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm glad that you're
conceding something. I've said that from day one.
Well, to be clear, you haven't. You did a debate. I don't remember the talk show, but you seem to imply that there was a lot of crossfire and then it might have been the IDF that killed a lot of...
I said that there is no question, because the names were published in Haaretz, there is no question that roughly of the 1,200 people killed, 800 of them were civilians. 850, fine. So I never said that, but then I said, no, we don't know exactly how they were killed, but 800 civilians killed, no, 850, no question there. And I also said on repeated occasions, there cannot be any doubt, in my opinion, as of now, with the available evidence, that Hamas was responsible for significant atrocities. And I made sure to include the plural.
There's a lot of tricky language being employed here. Do you think of the
There's
850?
Nothing tricky. It's called attaching value to words and not talking like a motor mouth.
Okay.
I am very careful about qualifying, because that's what language is about.
That's great. Then let me just ask a clarifying question. Do you firmly believe that the majority of the 850 civilians were killed by Hamas?
My view is, even if it were half, 400 is a huge number. By any reckoning, it's
okay. Wait, you didn't.
I said
wait,
even
wait,
if
wait,
because
wait,
Benny, because Professor Morris, I don't know. I agree with Mouin Rabbani. I'm not sure if he concedes the 400. I'll say
why 400?
Because I
whoever
have
thought up the
because
number 400.
right as I
800
said
of the 850
Well,
were slaughtered
because-
by Hamas.
if I may.
Maybe a couple of individuals were killed in the Israeli action.
I don't know.
You're saying from
Professor
day one you
Morris,
believe this
Professor-
particular thing, and
Professor
you
Morris,
clearly don't. You clearly
I
don't
said
believe this
from
thing. You don't.
day one,
You said people died. That's not
No.
controversial.
Wait,
Okay,
hold on. If I may.
That's not controversial.
Mr. Bonnell, I attach value to words.
Yes, you said that.
When
If you
I,
value them,
when
you start
I
repeating them
was,
so
yes,
much.
Mr. Bonnell, please slow down the speech and attempt to listen. When I was explicitly asked by Piers Morgan, I said there can be no question that Hamas committed atrocities
I've heard this,
on
yes.
October 7th. If you want me to pin down a number, I can't do that.
I didn't ask you to
but
pin
I
down a
may-
number. You can listen to
You
what I'm
didn't
saying.
ask me?
No, my question is,
Okay.
I'll ask
Mr.
a
Bonnell,
very
I
precise
cannot
question.
give it to you because
Excuse
you're
me.
not.
It's
If
a
I
very,
under-
it's a very easy
If I
question.
understood your question correctly.
My question is, do you think the majority of the people that were killed on
Yes.
October 7th, the civilians, were killed by Hamas,
Yes.
or are we subscribing to the idea that the IDF killed hundreds,
No,
400 or 500 in the
but
crossfire?
let me explain why that's a difficult question to answer. The total number of civilians killed was 800, 850.
Mhm.
We know that Hamas is responsible probably for the majority of those killings. We also know that there were killings by Islamic Jihad. We also know...
Well, we're bunching together the Islamic Jihad and the Hamas. So that's
Well, but his
splitting hairs
question
now.
was
No,
specifically
but he means
about-
he means
it's
the
clear.
raiders. He means the raiders.
I'm speaking in opposition to the conspiracy theory that people like. Do you prefer Norm or Professor Finkelstein, or what do you? I don't know how do you prefer
Well,
to be
it's not a
addressed?
conspiracy theory.
Well,
Because
the
it's
conspiracy theory is the idea that the IDF killed the majority of them.
It's not a conspiracy theory.
And then there's
the
also
majority-
also a theory that, as Norm pointed out on the show that he was on, that he thought that it was very strange that, given how reputable Israeli services are when it comes to sending ambulances, retrieving bodies, he thought it was very strange that that number was continually being adjusted.
And do you know
so
why?
when you say that in combination with, well, I'm not sure how many were
Well,
killed
do
by
you know
Hamas
why
versus
the
IDF.
number? Do you know why the number went down? The number went down because the Israeli authorities were in possession of 200 corpses that were burned to a crisp, that they assumed were Israelis who had been killed on October 7th. They later determined that these were in fact Palestinian fighters. Now, how does a Palestinian fighter get burned to a crisp?
No, you're mixing two things.
I don't
Some
think
of the
that's the question.
bodies they weren't able to identify, and eventually they ruled that some of them were actually Arab marauders rather than Israeli victims. A few of them also, of the Jews, were burnt to a crisp. And it took them time to work this out. And they came out initially with a slightly higher figure, 1,400 dead, and eventually reduced it to 1,200
and the
dead
reason
Israelis.
And the reason is that a proportion of Israeli civilians killed on October 7th, I don't believe it was a majority. We don't know how many. Some were killed in crossfire. Some were killed by Israeli shell fire, helicopter fire, and so on. And the majority were killed by Palestinians. And of that majority, we don't know. I mean, again, I understood your question as referring specifically to Hamas, which is why I tried to answer it that way. But if you meant generically Palestinians, yes. If you mean specifically Hamas, we don't have a clear breakdown of how many
No, I don't mean
were
specifically
killed.
Hamas.
Okay.
But I just think when you use the word some, that's doing a lot of heavy
Who
lifting.
used some?
That's fine, but some can mean anywhere from 1% to 49%.
But we don't know.
Some.
So the numbers here and the details are interesting and important almost from a legal perspective. But if we zoom out, the moral perspective, are Palestinians from Gaza justified in violent resistance?
Well, Palestinians have the right to resistance. That right includes the right to armed resistance. At the same time, armed resistance is subject to the laws of war. And there are very clear regulations that separate legitimate acts of armed resistance from acts of armed resistance that are not legitimate. And
The attacks of October 7th, where did they land for you?
there's been almost exclusive focus on the attacks on civilian population centers and the killings of civilians on October 7th. What is much less discussed, to the point of amnesia, is that there were very extensive attacks on Israeli military and intelligence facilities on October 7th. I would make a very clear distinction between those two. And secondly, I'm not sure that I would characterize the efforts by Palestinians on October 7th to seize Israeli territory and Israeli population centers as in and of themselves illegitimate.
You mean attacking Israeli civilians is legitimate?
No, that's not what I
didn't
said.
understand what you said.
I think what you had on October 7th was an effort by Hamas to seize Israeli territory and population
and
centers.
kill civilians.
That's not what I said. What I said is I think I would not describe the effort to seize Israeli territory as in and of itself illegitimate, as a separate issue from the killing of Israeli civilians, where in those cases where they had been deliberately targeted, that's very clearly illegitimate.
Whole families were slaughtered in kibbutzim.
But I'm making
Many of them
quick.
left-wingers, incidentally, who helped Palestinians go to hospitals in Israel and so on.
Again,
even drove Palestinian cancer patients to hospitals in Israeli.
I'm making a distinction
here. But you don't seem
here.
to be very condemnatory of what the Hamas did.
Well, I don't do selective condemnation.
I'm not talking about selective.
I don't do selective
specific
outrage.
Condemnation of this specific.
Well, you know what it is. You know,
I would, for example, condemn Israeli assaults on civilians, deliberate assaults on civilians.
Yes,
I would condemn them, but you're not doing that with the Hamas.
You know what the issue is? I've been speaking in public now, I would say since the late 1980s, and interviewed and so on. I have never on one occasion ever been asked to condemn any Israeli act. When I've been in group discussions, those supporting the Israeli action or perspective, I have never encountered an example where these individuals are asked to condemn what Israel is doing. The demand and obligation of condemnation is exclusively applied, in my personal experience over decades, is exclusively applied to Palestinians.
No, this is nonsense. Israel is condemned day and night on every television channel, on every and has been for the last decade.
I'm telling you about a personal experience lasting decades.
You said, quote.
Oh, no.
I'm trying to quote what you just said.
I shouldn't have said anything at any point.
You should say, Professor Morris.
Yes.
You just said, I would condemn anytime Israel deliberately attacks civilians.
Yes.
Okay? The problem, Professor Morris, is over and over again, you claim in the face of overwhelming evidence that they didn't attack civilians.
That's not true. I've said Israel has attacked civilians.
Professor
in Kibya, Israel attacked civilians.
Professor
and I've
Morris.
written extensively about it.
I know that.
In Kafr Qasim, they killed civilians. And I've written
and now
that.
let's.
So you're just eliminating, you're selecting as Stephen says, you cherry pick.
If I were
you cherry pick.
Let's fast forward when you were an adult. What did you say about the 1982 Lebanon War?
What did I say?
You don't remember? Okay. Allow me. Okay. So it happens that I was not at all I had no interest in the Israel-Palestine conflict as a young man until the 1982 Lebanon War.
Yeah. I lost the passage.
I'll find it.
Okay, real quick, while he's searching for that.
Yeah, allow me.
You bring up something that's really important that a lot of people don't draw a distinction between, in that there is just causes for war and there's just ways to act within a war. And these two things principally do have a distinction from one another.
Correct.
However, while I appreciate the recognition of the distinction, the idea that the cause for war that Hamas was engaged in, I don't believe, if we look at their actions in war or the statements that they've made, it doesn't seem like it had to do with territorial acquisition.
No. The point,
taking land back.
The point I was making was what was Hamas trying to achieve militarily on October 7th? And I was pointing out that the focus has been very much on Hamas attacks on civilians and atrocities and so on. And I'm not saying those things should be ignored. What I'm saying is that what's getting lost in the shuffle is that there were extensive attacks on military and intelligence facilities.
Mm-hmm.
And as far as the, let's say, the other aspects are concerned, because I think either you or Lex asked me about the legitimacy of these attacks, I said, I'm unclear whether efforts by Hamas to seize Israeli population centers in and of themselves are illegitimate, as opposed to actions that either deliberately targeted Israeli civilians or actions that should reasonably have been expected to result in the killings of Israeli civilians. Those strike me as, by definition, illegitimate. And I want to be very clear about that.
Illegitimate means you condemn them.
Illegitimate means they are not legitimate. I have a problem
Condemning
with,
your side, yes.
no, not condemning my side. I have a problem with selective outrage, and I have a problem with selective condemnation. And as I explained to you a few minutes ago, in my decades of appearing in public and being interviewed, I have never seen, I've never been asked to condemn an Israeli action. I've never been asked for a moral judgment on an Israeli action. Exclusive request for condemnation has to do with what Palestinians do, and just as importantly, I'm sure if you watch BBC or CNN, when is the last time an Israeli spokesperson has been asked to condemn an Israeli act? I've never seen it.
I don't think we condemn the Arab side either, though, right? I don't think there was any condemnation. There wasn't
No, but
much.
now that we're talking about Israeli victims, all of a sudden morality is
Well,
central.
I think the reason why it comes up is because there's no shortage of international condemnation for Israel. As Norm will point out a million times, that there are 50 billion UN resolutions. You've got Amnesty International. You've got multiple bodies of the UN. You've got now this case for the ICJ. So there's no question of if there's condemnation for Israel.
Sorry if I can interrupt you. In 1948, the entire world stood behind the establishment of a Jewish state in the entire world.
Except the Arab states and the Muslim states.
Well,
not the entire world.
Okay, but I think you know what I mean by that.
The Western democracies, that's what you're saying.
Well, and then also, just my
Western
quick question.
democracies supported the establishment of Israel.
My quick question was, you said that you believe that, this is a very short one, you don't have to, it's just, you think that there's an argument to be made that the people in Gaza, that Hamas and Islamic Jihad, or whoever participated, had a just cause for war. Maybe they didn't do it in the correct way, but they maybe had a just cause for war.
I don't think there's a maybe there. The Palestinians.
Okay, you think they absolutely had a just cause for it.
Yes.
Do you think that Israel has a just cause for Operation Swords of Iron?
No, of course not.
Okay. All right. You can say your quote.
Okay. First of all, on this issue of double standards, which is the one that irks or irritates Mouin, you said that you are not a person of double standards, unlike people like Mouin. You hold high a single standard, and you condemn deliberate Israeli attacks on
Civilians.
When they occurred, yeah.
And I would say that's true for the period up till 1967, and I think it's accurate, your account of the First Intifada. There, it seems to me, you are in conformity with most mainstream accounts, and the case of the First Intifada, you also used, surprisingly, you used Arab human rights sources like Al-Haq, which I think Mouin worked for during the First Intifada. That's true. But then something very strange happens. So let's illustrate it.
Wait, there's something strange which happened is the Arabs rejected
Okay, wait.
peace offers. That's what happened.
Well,
by accepting the Oslo agreements.
Yeah.
Not the,
By rejecting, he's talking about Camp David and
Camp
Taffa.
David.
If we have time, I know the record very well. I'd be very happy to go through it with you. But let's get to those double standards. So, this is what you have to say about Israel's invasion of Lebanon in 1982. You said Israel was reluctant to harm civilians, sought to avoid casualties on both sides, and took care not to harm Lebanese and Palestinian civilians. You then went on to acknowledge the massive use of IDF firepower against civilians during the siege of Beirut, which traumatized Israeli society. Morris quickly enters the caveat that Israel, quote, tried to pinpoint military targets, but inevitably many civilians were hit. That's your description of the Lebanon War. As I say, that's when I first got involved in the conflict. I am a voracious reader. I read everything on the Lebanon War. I would say there's not a single account of the Lebanon War in which the estimates are between 15 and 20,000 Palestinian and Lebanese were killed, overwhelmingly civilians, the biggest bloodletting until the current Gaza genocide, biggest bloodletting. I would say I can't think of a single mainstream account that remotely approximates what you just said. So, leaving aside, I can name the books, voluminous, huge volumes. I'll just take one example. Now, you will remember, because I think you served in Lebanon in 82, am I correct on that?
Yeah.
Yeah. So you will remember that Dov Yarmia kept a war diary. So, with your permission, allow me to describe what he wrote during his diary. So, he writes, "The war machine of the IDF is galloping and trampling over the conquered territory, demonstrating a total insensitivity to the fate of the Arabs who are found in its path. A PLO-run hospital suffered a direct hit. Thousands of refugees are returning to the city. When they arrive at their homes, many of which have been destroyed or damaged, you hear their cries of pain and their howls over the deaths of their loved ones. The air is permeated with the smell of corpses. Destruction and death are continuing."
What you're making,
does that sound like your description of the Lebanon War?
Forget my descriptions.
Forget it?
The point you're making.
Words are in print. We can't just forget
let me
them.
just finish my sentence. The point you're making, which you somehow forget, is that there are Israelis who strongly criticize their own side and describe how Israelis are doing things which they regard as immoral. You don't find that on the Arab side.
I'm talking about
Don't
you,
find that.
Mr. Morris.
Don't
I'm not
forget
talking
me.
about Dev
Don't hear me out. It's the
I'm
left
talking
wing.
about you, the historian. How did you depict the Lebanon
Because
War?
I believe that the Israeli military tried to avoid committing a civilian casualty. As I think they've tried
all
to do
the
in Gaza now.
accounts by Robert Fisk and Pity the
Robert
Nation.
Fisk is
I know.
an anti-Zionist journalist.
I know.
Has always been.
Right. So that's why you can say with such confidence that you don't condemn deliberate Israeli attacks on civilians. Because there weren't any.
No, I didn't say there weren't any.
Yeah, you
And
didn't?
You agreed that I have condemned Israeli attacks on civilians.
I never quarrel with facts. Your description of the 1982 war is so shocking, it makes my innards writhe. And then your description of the Second Intifada, your description of defensive shield,
when the Arabs were bombing, when Arab suicide bombers were destroying Jews in masses in buses and in restaurants. That's the Second Intifada. Do you remember that?
You can try
suicide bombers in Jerusalem's buses and restaurants.
I am completely aware of that. But if you forgot the numbers,
I don't forget.
It was 3-1.
They killed mostly armed Palestinian gunmen.
That's what you say in your book. But that's not what Amnesty International said. That's not what Human Rights Watch said.
I don't remember what they said.
I do.
No,
that's not what
I don't know whether
said.
their figures are right. My figures are right.
Listen.
In the Second Intifada, some 4,000 Palestinians were killed. Most of them armed people, and the Israelis, 1,000 Israelis were killed. Almost all of them civilians.
Professor Morris, fantasy, but I'm not going to argue with here. Here's a simple challenge. You said not to look at the camera. Scares the people. I'll make the open challenge.
You are going to scare them.
No. Professor Morris.
Open challenge.
Words are in print. I wrote 50 pages analyzing all of your work. I quote, some will say cherry pick, but I think accurately quote you. Here's a simple challenge. Answer me in print. Answer what I wrote and show where I'm making things up. Answer me
I'm
in
not
print.
familiar. I'm sorry,
Okay,
but I'm not familiar
no,
with what
that's
you
no
wrote.
problem. You're a busy man. You're an important historian. You don't have to know everything that's in print, especially by modest publishers. But now you know. And so here's the public challenge. You answer and show where I cherry picked, where I misrepresented.
Send me the article. I
Fine.
will
And,
respond.
and then we can have a civil, scholarly discussion.
I'm not
and
sure we will agree, even if
we don't have to agree.
Oh,
It's
okay.
for the reader to decide, looking at both sides,
Okay.
where does truth stand.
Norman,
said
and if
the-
I may ask,
Yeah.
it's good to discuss ideas that are in the air now as opposed to citing literature that was written in the past as much as possible, because listeners were not familiar with the literature. So, like, whatever was written, just express it, condense the key idea, and then we can debate the ideas or
No,
discuss the
there are
ideas.
two aspects. There's a public debate, but there's also written words.
Yes, I'm just telling you that you, as a academic historian, put a lot of value in the written word, and I
Correct.
think it is valuable. But in this
He's
context,
incidentally not the only historian who puts value to words.
Yes.
I also do, actually.
Yes.
Yeah,
But
just so we.
in
so-
More than just one or two sentences at a time.
and,
Yeah.
but this in this context, just for the educational purpose
Well, the
of teaching people.
educational purpose is, why would people commit what I have to acknowledge, because I am faithful to the facts, massive atrocities on October 7th? Why did that happen? And I think that's the problem. The past is erased, and we suddenly went from 1948 to October 7th, 2023. And there's a problem there.
So first of all, you have complete freedom to backtrack, and we'll go there with you. Obviously, we can't cover every single year, every single event, but there's probably critical moments in time.
Can I respond to something relating to the Lebanon War? I looked at the book that he got this from and what the quote was from. It sounds cold to say it, but war is tragic and civilians die. There is no war that this has not happened in the history of all of humankind. The statement that Israel might take care not to target civilians is not incompatible with a diary entry from someone who said they saw civilians getting killed. I think that sometimes we do a lot of weird games when we talk about international humanitarian law or laws that govern conflict, where we say things like civilians dying is a war crime, or civilian homes or hospitals getting destroyed is necessarily a war crime, or is necessarily somebody intentionally targeting civilians without making distinctions between military targets or civilian ones. I think that when we analyze different attacks, or when we talk about the conduct of a military, I think it's important to understand, like prospectively, from the unit of analysis of the actual military committing the acts, what's happening and what are the decisions being made, rather than just saying retrospectively, oh, well, a lot of civilians died, not very many, military people died, comparatively speaking, so it must have been war crimes, especially when you've got another side, I'll fast forward to Hamas, that intentionally attempts to induce those same civilian numbers, because Hamas is guilty of any war crime that you would potentially accuse, and this is according to Amnesty International, people that Norm loves to cite. Hamas is guilty of all of these same war crimes, of them failing to take care of the civilian population, of them essentially utilizing human shields to try to fire rockets free from attack. Essentially, yes. I'm just saying that essentially, as in terms of how international law defines it, not how Amnesty International defines it, but Amnesty International describes times of human shielding, but they don't actually apply the correct international legal standard.
You don't know what's the correct international law. You haven't
but
Norm,
I absolutely
you
do.
haven't
Norm.
a clue.
I absolutely
I
do.
think,
but I'm just saying,
Wikipedia.
I'm just saying, believe it or not, Norm, the entire Geneva Convention is all on Wikipedia. It's a wonderful website. But I'm just saying that on the Hamas side, if there's an attempt to induce this type of military activity, attempt to induce civilian harm, that it's not just enough to say, like, well, here's a diary entry where a guy talks about how tragic these attacks are.
I think the problem with your statement is that if you go back and listen to it, the first part of it is war is hell, civilians die. It's a fact of life, and you state that in a very factual manner. Then when you start talking about Hamas, all of a sudden you've discovered morality. And you've discovered condemnation, and you've discovered intent, and you are unfortunately far from alone in this. I'll give you, you know who for me is a perfect example?
Well, wait, hold on. Just in response, we don't need examples.
No, go
the
ahead.
false equivalency of the two sides is astounding. When Hamas kills civilians in a surprise attack on October 7th, this isn't because they are attempting to target military targets and they happen to stumble into a giant festival of people that.
Well, they did happen to stumble into it.
They did, but
And they killed 300
yeah,
people.
but they did. But
In
when
the
they
Yes.
stumbled
Festival.
into it, it wasn't an issue of trying to figure out a military target or not. They weren't failing a distinction. There wasn't a proportionality assessment done. It was just to kill civilians. Even the Amnesty International in 2008 and in 2014, and even today, will continue to say that things like the types of attacks.
Find anyone who will deny that Hamas has targeted civilians.
Sure.
You gave the example
But there's a difference because
of suicide bombings during the Second Intifada. I mean, facts are facts.
Sure. But I'm just saying that the Hamas targeting of civilians is different than the incidental loss of life that occurs when Israel does.
How, genocide is the intentional mass murder.
Genocide is an entirely separate claim.
Yeah,
right?
but the idea that Israel is not in the business of intentionally targeting civilians, I know that's what we're supposed to believe, but the historical record stands very clearly.
I don't believe it does.
You've written about it yourself.
When you say historical, do you mean like in the 40s to the 60s, or do you mean like
I
over
would
the past,
say
like Gaza?
from the 30s of the last century to the 20s of this century? I just like to make the way you characterized it. I think the best example of that I've come across during this specific conflict is John Kirby, the White House spokesman. I've named him Tears Tosterone for a very good reason. When he's talking about Palestinian civilian deaths, war is hell, it's a fact of life, get used to it. When he was confronted with Israeli civilian deaths on October 7th, he literally broke down in tears.
But he understood that one is deliberate and one isn't. He understood that.
No, that's what he tried to make us understand.
No, he was speaking facts. The Hamas guys who attacked the kibbutzim, apart from the attacks on the military sites, when they attacked the kibbutzim, were out to kill civilians, and they killed family after family, house after house. The Israeli attacks on Hamas installations and fire. I don't know better. No, you don't know Israeli pilots. That's the problem.
Thank God.
You don't know Israeli pilots. They believe that they are killing Hamasniks. They're given certain objectives, and that's what they attack. And if the Hamas is hiding behind civilians die.
Every time they target a kid, I'm sure they believe it's Hamas. When they killed the 4 kids on the
they believe.
Yeah, I know they believed it, even though they were diminutive size. Even though they were diminutive.
From that angle, you don't see the size.
Yeah, no, they saw.
You don't see the size.
Let's leave aside.
Oh, I know what he's quoting from, but you've lied about this particular instance in the past. Those kids weren't just on the beaches, as often stated in articles. Those kids were literally coming out of a previously identified Hamas compound that they had operated from. They literally did. You could Google it.
With all due respect, you're such a fantastic moron. It's terrifying. That wharf was filled with journalists. There were scores of journalists. That was an old fisherman's shack. What are you talking about? It's so painful. It's so painful to listen to this idiocy.
And to be clear, on the other side, you're implying that a strike was okayed on the Israeli side, where they said, we're just going to kill 4 Palestinian children today for no reason.
Do you believe that?
Do you believe that? Do you believe that? Right. As you said, right, there was a hotel of journalists. Do you think that they were out to kill 4 children?
Here we go.
You will never answer that
I
question.
will answer the question.
Pilots were out to kill 4 children.
And it was approved because that was a strike. That was a drone strike. So it was approved all the way up the chain that we're going to kill children today. We're going to kill Palestinian children today.
You want me to answer, or do you want your motor mouth to go? Okay, answer. In 2018, there was the Great March of Return in Gaza. By all reckonings of human rights organizations and journalists who were there, it was overwhelmingly nonviolent.
But organized by the Hamas.
Whoever organized it.
It was organized by Satan. Let's start
Satan.
with
by Hamas.
Okay,
by
Satan.
Yeah.
I agree. Let's go for the big one. The big Megillah. It's Satan. Okay? Overwhelmingly organized, overwhelmingly nonviolent. Resembled at the beginning the first Intifada.
They
represent the
threw bombs
first.
here and there,
Yeah. Okay. Not bombs. But
they tried to make holes in the fence.
Okay.
Obviously.
Let's continue.
Yeah.
So.
But I'm not sure Israel behaved morally in that respect.
Okay.
No.
Okay. Wait.
I'm willing to grant you
Please. Please.
I'm willing to
Allow
grant it.
me to.
You don't have to pursue
allow
it
me.
because I'm
Okay.
willing to grant.
Allow me to finish.
I don't know anything about this. I'd like to hear.
Okay. So, as you know, along the Gaza perimeter, there was Israel's best trained snipers. Correct?
I don't know best trained. There were
But-
snipers.
Fine.
Snipers.
Okay. All right.
The
Because
editorializing.
hey, laugh. It's hilarious. The story's so funny.
You're lying about
It's
the Great
so
March of Return
funny.
had aspects of
Okay.
violence to it.
Okay.
According, even the UN says it themselves.
Okay.
But you only collect what the UN says that you
You
like.
see, the problem, Mr. Morelli, is you don't know the English language. You don't.
I can read from the
If you
UN
hear-
website
did
itself.
I
In regards
say-
to the Great March of Return,
Please
they said,
stop with your
while the vast
idiotic-
majority of
with your
protesters have
idiotic-
acted in a peaceful manner,
No, listen to what
during
he
most
said.
protests,
Did you-
dozens have
did you
approached the
just
fence,
agree with
attempting
me,
to
Mr.
damage it,
said there was
burning
all
fires,
Did I
throwing
say
stones and
overwhelmingly
Molotov cocktails
nonviolent?
towards Israeli forces, and
Okay.
flying incendiary
Okay.
kites and balloons
Okay.
into Israeli territory. The latter resulted
Yeah,
in
but-
extensive
but
damage
you
to
don't-
agricultural land and
okay.
nature reserves inside
Okay.
Israel and risked the lives
Yeah,
of Israeli
because
civilians.
Mr.
Some incidents of
Mr.
shooting and throwing of
Borelli-
explosives
Yeah,
have also been
talk
reported.
fast,
I'm
so
just
people
trying to-
think that you're coherent.
I'm just reading from the
Okay.
UN.
Yeah, but you see,
I know you like them sometimes, only when they agree with you, though.
You got the months wrong. You got the months wrong. We're talking about the beginning in March 30th, 2018.
You just described that march as mostly peaceful.
Okay, allow me to finish. So there were the snipers, okay? Now you find it so far-fetched. Israelis purposely, deliberately targeting civilians? That's such a far-fetched idea. An overwhelmingly non-violent march. What did the international
It wasn't a
investigation?
march. It was a campaign.
Yeah,
which
whatever
went
you
on
want to
for-
call
for
it.
months.
Whatever you want to call
For
it.
months.
Yeah. What did the UN investigation find?
Well, he just read it. to you.
I read the report. I don't read things off of those machines. I read the report. What did it find? Brace yourself. You thought it was so funny, the idea of IDF targeting civilians. It found, go look this up on your machine.
I already know what you're going to say. You're
It
going to say it found that
targeted
only one or
children,
two of them were
targeted
justified
children,
killings.
targeted journalists, targeted medics, and here's the funniest one of all. It's so hilarious. They targeted disabled people who were 300 meters away from the fence and just standing by trees.
This is true. If what
If
you're saying
it's
is true.
true,
If what you're
By
saying
the
is
way,
true.
just quick pause. I think everything was fascinating to listen to, except the mention of hilarious. Nobody finds any of this hilarious. And if any of us are laughing, it's not at the suffering of civilians or suffering of anyone. It's at the obvious joyful camaraderie in the room. So I'm enjoying it, and also the joy of learning. So thank you.
Can we talk about the targeting civilian thing a little bit? I think there's like an important
Great
underlying,
March, you mean? Yeah.
not necessarily that. I think it's important to understand. Yeah, I think it's important to understand. There's like three different things here that we need to think about. So one is a policy of killing civilians. So I would ask the other side. I'm going to ask all three because I know there won't be a short answer. Do you think there is a policy top down from the IDF to target civilians? That's one thing. Yeah. A second thing is
He said yes.
When I understand, yeah, sure, okay, yeah, that's fine. Okay, but then the second thing is, or there's two distinctions I want to draw between. I think Benny would say this. I would say this. I'm sure, undoubtedly, there have been cases where IDF soldiers, for no good reason, have targeted and killed Palestinians that they should not have done. That would be prosecutable as war crimes, as defined by the Rome Statute and the ICC.
Some have been prosecuted.
Yeah, and I'm absolutely sure.
Practically none.
I'm sure that we would all agree for soldiers that happens. But I think that it's important. That when we talk about military strikes, or we talk about things especially involving bombings or drone attacks, these are things that are signed off by multiple different layers of command, by multiple people involved in an operation, including intelligence gathering, including weaponeering, and there also have typically lawyers involved. When you make the claim that an IDF soldier shot a Palestinian, those three people, the three hostages that came up with white flags, and something horrible happened, I think that's a fair statement to make, and I think a lot of criticism is deserved. But when you make the statement that 4 children were killed by a strike, the claim that you're making, the claim that you're making is that multiple levels of the IDF signed off on just killing.
I have no idea what
That's great. If you don't understand the process, then let me educate you. I can tell you. I do understand the process. I'm telling you. I'm trying to explain you right now.
IDF. You've
basic
studied
military.
the
You can
IDF.
ask anybody that's
Aside
talked
from
about.
Wikipedia, can you
Yes,
tell
you
me
can
what
talk
your
to
knowledge
people.
of
You
the
can talk to
IDF is?
people who
Apart from
work in the
Wikipedia,
military.
what's your knowledge of
You
the
know what? The
IDF?
audience can look this up. Do you think that bombing and strikes are decided by one person in the field? Do you think one person
I
is in control of
respond
an
to
What
that?
he's
airplane or a
trying to
drone
tell you
strike?
is a pilot doesn't do it on
Yes,
his own.
strike
Can I
cells have
respond?
entire
Whole
apparatuses
hierarchy.
that are designed to figure out how to strike and who to strike. So when you say that 4 children are targeted, you're saying that a whole apparatus is
You
trying
make
to
my
murder
argument better than
4
me.
Palestinian
You make
children,
my argument
which is
better
a
than me.
ridiculous argument.
Because, really, that it's impossible at the command level. It's impossible at
didn't
the
say
command
impossible.
level. But you said that they couldn't have done it at the bottom if it weren't also
You
at
just
the
need
top.
to, you don't understand the
So-
strength
oh,
of the
I don't
claim that you're
understand. Please,
making. You're
with
saying
all
that
due
from
respect,
a top-down level, that lawyers,
with
multiple
all due
commanders have
respect,
told all these
Mr.
people
Bonnell,
signed
do
off
not tell me
on
what I don't
killing
understand.
4 Palestinians.
It's true.
Children.
It's true. I don't spend my nights on Wikipedia. I read books. I admit that as a signal.
waste of time,
Yeah,
by the way.
as
We're wasting time
I
right
know,
now.
books are a waste of time. With all due regard,
Well,
there.
for you they are. The only thing you take from them are 2 or 3 quotes that you use.
I
Yeah.
completely respect the fact, and I'll say it on the air, as much as I find totally disgusting what's come of your politics, a lot of the books are excellent. And I'll even tell you, because I'm not afraid of saying it, whenever I have to check on a basic fact, the equivalent of going to the Britannica, I go to your books. I know you got a lot of the facts right.
Benny Morris books for the listener.
I would never say books are a waste of time. And it's regrettable to you that you got strapped with a partner who thinks that all the wisdom,
He didn't say they're a waste of time.
I'd like to respond to what you were saying. I think the question that we're trying to answer,
I think you don't understand Israel,
let me finish,
really
please.
understands Israel.
I think we're
how
all
it works.
I think we're all agreed that Palestinians have deliberately targeted civilians, whether we're talking about Hamas and Islamic Jihad today or previously.
I prefer the word murdered and raped rather than targeted. Targeted is too soft for what the Hamas did.
I'm okay with
I'm not talking about.
I'm talking about this now.
Yeah, but I'm trying to answer his question.
Okay.
Historically, there is substantial evidence that Palestinians have targeted civilians. Whether it's been incidental or systematic is a different discussion. I don't want to get into that now. For some reason, there seems to be a huge debate about whether any Israeli has ever sunk so low as to target a civilian.
No, we've agreed. Both said that. We've just said that this has happened here and there.
And I think
we've agreed on that.
I think
what we're saying is it's not policy, which is what you guys are implying, that they kill civilians deliberately.
If I understand you correctly, you're basically making the claim that none of these attacks could have happened without going through an entire chain of command.
For strike cells that are involved in like drone attacks or plane attacks or
My understanding of the Israeli military, and you could perhaps, you've served in it, you would know better, it's actually a fairly chaotic organization.
No, that's not true. Especially not the Air Force. Extremely, extremely organized. The Air Force works in a very organized fashion, as he says, with lawyers, a chain of command, and ultimately the pilot drops the bomb where he's told to drop it.
In Protective Edge, was that 200 strikes in like 60 seconds, I think? I think at the opening of Protective Edge? Like the coordination between...
You're talking about 2008.
I think Protective Edge was 2014. But I'm just saying that the coordination in the military is pretty tight.
My understanding of the Israeli military
it's very organized.
is that it's quite chaotic, and there's also a lot of testimonies from Israel. But be that as it may, okay, I'm prepared to accept both of your contentions that it's a highly organized and disciplined force. Air Force, under any scenario, is going to be more organized than the other branches. And you're saying such a strike would have been inconceivable.
Well, I'm not necessarily saying inconceivable. I'm just saying that that would have required
you're basically
murderous intent for so many different levels. I don't think good evidence has been presented to say that that's
your basic claim is that it would be fair to assume that such a strike could have only been carried out with multiple levels of authorization and signing off. Mm-hmm. Okay, let's accept that for the sake of argument. We have now seen incident after incident after incident after incident where entire families are vaporized. in single strikes.
Who is
We've
in the
seen
families? Who lives in the house
family
inside?
members.
No,
family
or next to the
members,
house in
family
which
members.
these families are
We
killed.
have seen incident.
Do you know that Hamasniks weren't in that house? Do you know that their
they
ammunition
were?
dumps weren't
Why
in
do I
those
have
houses?
to prove a negative?
You're saying that they deliberately targeted families.
Professor Morris, how
If
do
Israel wanted to kill civilians in Gaza, they could have killed 500,000 by now with the number of strikes they've done.
And
the
therefore,
fact that they've only
Actually,
killed a certain small number,
30,000 is a small number.
small number in
You
proportion.
consider 30,000
small
a small
number in
number.
proportion
Yeah.
over 4 months
12,000
probably
children
is
is
an indication
only.
that
12,000
it's
children is
targeted and that there are
only.
Hamas targets in these places.
So I've given
12,000 children is only. And if that's the case, why is
Did I
it?
use the
Yeah,
word
you said only. Only. Though, Professor Morris, here's a question for you. If we take every combat zone in the world for the past 3 years, every combat zone in the world.
In Vietnam,
okay?
the Americans killed
I said,
a million
I'm not
people.
talking about
Well, they could have
Vietnam.
killed 40 million.
I wasn't, I was again in the anti-war movement. So don't
Americans
strap me.
killed a million people in Vietnam.
Fine. And 30 million Russians were killed during World War II, so everything else is irrelevant. Okay.
Not
Here's a
everything
question.
relevant. Stick to
Professor Morris, here's a question. It's very perplexing. If you take every combat zone in the world for the past 3 years and you multiply the number of children killed by 4, every combat zone in the world, you get Gaza. Okay? So when you
What is
say
that supposed to prove?
okay, I'm going to tell you.
Firstly,
Just shut up.
You're relying
And
on
I'll tell
Hamas
you,
numbers.
No, I'm not
Hamas
relying.
numbers are
I'm
not
relying on the
necessarily
numbers
true.
that
You know
everybody
that.
else. I'm relying on the
Sure,
numbers.
even if we take the numbers, though, what does that prove?
Those are Hamas numbers.
Okay.
Which may not
Fine,
be true.
fine,
They could invent
fine.
anything because you
I
know
think-
that they are
I
a
think
mendacious organization.
I know mendacious. Believe me.
You like words.
mendacious, as in the
mendacious
Israeli
organization.
Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Okay, so here's the thing. You say they could have killed 500,000, but they only killed That's your word.
I'm
they only
saying that
killed
if you
30,000.
believe that they deliberately target civilians, they would have killed many more. The fact is that they don't deliberately target civilians.
Professor Morris,
And you don't understand
for a
Israeli
historian,
society.
I
You
don't want to
understand how it
understand
works.
Israeli society.
You don't
If you want to know the
understand how
truth,
it works.
I don't want to. I don't want to get inside their heads.
That's the problem.
90% of
A
Israel.
good historian
Yeah.
tries to get into the heads of
There's a limit.
the various
There's a limit.
protagonists.
There's a limit. When
That's what a good historian does.
90% of Israelis think that Israel's using enough or too little force in Gaza, I don't want to get inside that head. 40% think that Israel's using insufficient force in Gaza. I don't want to get inside that head. I don't want to get inside the head of people who think they're using insufficient force
Historians
against
must
the population,
understand.
against the population, half of which is children. I don't want to get inside that head. But here's the point, because your partner wants to know the point. You don't understand political constraints. One of your ministers said, let's drop an atomic bomb on
Do you
Gaza.
think he really meant that?
He
Well,
said it 3
you-
years.
No.
Hey,
It was said in a sort of a
Professor
very
Morris.
questionable
the
way.
day
He didn't
after-
say they should drop
Professor
an
He said
atomic
it
bomb.
the day
I'm not
after
supporting
the
him. He's an
ICJ
idiot.
met.
This
And he
minister,
said, I want
other-
the Hague
this
Convention.
minister is a messianic
none other
idiot.
than
But
Israel's,
he didn't say drop an atomic
none
bomb.
other than Israel's chief historian, the famed, justifiably famed Benny Morris, thinks we should be dropping nuclear weapons on Iran.
Iran has for years, its leaders for years have said we should destroy Israel.
Mm-hmm.
You agree with that? They've said we should destroy Israel. Israel must be destroyed. Is that correct? This is what the Iranian leaders have been saying since Khomeini.
I would say Iranian leaders have sent mixed messages.
Okay, but some of them have said, including
Mr. Burrell,
Khamenei
if you don't
and
know the
Khomeini.
evidence, if you don't
Wait,
know the
wait,
evidence,
This
why
is like
are
the
you
skepticism.
laughing?
It's very funny.
It's funny
Iran
because
that supports
it's-
Hezbollah
okay,
and the Houthis
okay.
and Hamas.
Oh,
maybe
yeah.
they want Israel destroyed.
Brace yourself.
Wait.
To the extent that
complicated.
the Houthis
It's
are
complicated.
to the extent that the Houthis are trying to stop the genocide in Gaza,
One, there is no genocide.
no
They don't have
genocide.
the right to
I
attack
support-
civilian ships.
I
know you
support the
selectively
Houthis.
support
There's no
international law when
I
it agrees
support-
with you,
okay.
and then when it doesn't, you decide
Okay.
to throw
If
international
you-
law to
There's
the
no
wind.
genocide in Gaza.
If
There's
you
no
like,
genocide.
Hold on a second. Norm,
Want me to read what you said?
Norm, stop, please. Norm, just for me, please,
Mhm.
just give me a second. You said that there's no genocide going on in Gaza.
Yes.
Let me ask that clear question.
Yes.
The same question I asked on the Hamas attacks. Is there, from a legal, philosophical, moral perspective, is there genocide going on in Gaza today?
Is there a genocide going on in Gaza? Well, in several years, we will have a definitive response
But at the
to that
moment,
question.
so
What has happened thus far is that on the 29th of December, the Republic of South Africa instituted proceedings against Israel pursuant to the 1948 Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. South Africa basically accused Israel of perpetrating genocide in the Gaza Strip. On the 26th of January, the court issued its initial ruling. The court at this stage is not making a determination on whether Israel has or has not committed genocide. So just as it has not found Israel guilty, it certainly also hasn't found Israel innocent. What the court had to do at this stage was take one of two decisions. Either South Africa's case was the equivalent of a frivolous lawsuit and dismiss it and close the proceedings, or it had to determine that South Africa presented a plausible case that Israel was violating its obligations under the Genocide Convention, and that it would, on that basis, hold a full hearing. Now, a lot of people have looked at the court's ruling of the 26th of January and focused on the fact that the court did not order a ceasefire. I actually wasn't expecting it to order a ceasefire, and I wasn't surprised that it didn't, because in the other cases that the court has considered, most prominently Bosnia and Myanmar, it also didn't order a ceasefire. And South Africa, in requesting a ceasefire, also didn't ask the court to render an opinion on the legitimacy or lack thereof of Israel's military operation. From my perspective, the key issue on the 26th of January was whether the court would simply dismiss the case or decide to proceed with it.
and it decided to proceed. We
And
don't-
it
we don't have to
decided
go
to
through a
proceed.
lot
And I
of
think
those.
that's enormously.
I thought that was
I think that's
beautifully
enormously
sweet.
But you said they
significant.
committed genocide. You already said they committed genocide.
I also
Israel
like-
is committing genocide.
But
You
if I
used
could
that
just
word.
allow me,
Use that word.
That's correct.
now,
I don't run away.
So
from
Norman,
my
you
word.
did say Israel
Norm,
committing
I would
genocide.
Can you
say-
let Mouin
yeah.
finish?
yeah. Well, the end of the story is you specifically asked whether I think Israel is committing genocide. I explained formally there is no finding, and as you said, we won't know for a number of years. And I think there's legitimate questions to be raised. I mean, in the Bosnia case, which I think all four of us would agree was clearly a case of genocide, the court
You
determined.
mean by the Serbs?
Yes.
Yeah.
In the Bosnia case, the court determined that of all the evidence placed before them, only Srebrenica qualified as genocide, and all the other atrocities committed did not qualify as genocide. You know, international law is a developing organism. I don't know how the court is going to respond in this case, so I wouldn't take it as a foregone conclusion how the court is going to respond.
But
But
Norman has determined already.
I have too, because you're asking my personal
Personal
opinion.
opinion is also
So as a matter of law, I want to state very clearly, it has not been determined and won't be determined for several years. Based on my observations and the evidence before me, I would say it's indisputable that Israel is engaged in a genocidal assault against the Palestinian people in the Gaza
Which is the
Strip.
PLO line.
Get with the
Genocidal.
program. The PLO is long past.
What
Okay, the
what
Palestinian
defines
Authority.
as you were saying, genocide is not a body count. Genocide consists of two elements: the destruction of a people in whole or in part. So, in other words, you can commit genocide by
With
killing
5
30,000 people. It doesn't have, well, 5 probably is below
There
the
is a problem
threshold.
of numbers.
Yes, but I think 30,000 crosses the threshold. and not reaching 500,000 is probably irrelevant. And the second element is there has to be an intent. In other words,
And you believe there's an intent?
yes, I think if there is any other plausible reason for why all these people are being murdered, it's not genocide. And as far as intent is
What about
concerned,
hiding behind a human shield? You don't think that's a reason for them being killed?
well, let's get the intent part out of the way first. South Africa's
Forget South Africa. They're not the party.
well, I'd
They
like to
made-
finish.
they
They're
I'd
just
made
like
the
to,
application.
government. That's got nothing to do with anything.
I think they're
Hamas.
pro-Satan as well last time
No,
I
they're
checked.
pro-Hamas.
You know, for some reason, you don't have a problem with people being pro-Israeli at the time of this, but if they support Palestinians' right to life or self-determination, they get demonized and
Not because of
delegitimized
that,
as
because they
pro-Hamas.
supported an organization which murdered 1,200 people deliberately. That's my problem.
But supporting a state that has murdered 30,000.
But they
is okay
haven't,
for
because
you.
these are 30,000
Okay.
are basically human
Well, just to
shields
get back-
used by the Hamas,
Okay.
And
in
you-
which the
just-
Hamas
and
wanted,
please, Norm.
wanted killed.
Okay, if
They
I
wanted
could-
them killed.
All right, if
The
I could,
Hamas wanted these people
sure.
killed.
If I could just get
You don't think they wanted them killed? They
No,
didn't
I don't.
provide them with shelters. They build tunnels for their fighters,
Okay,
but
if I
not
could get
one
back to my
shelter
point.
for their own civilians.
You asked me about
Of
intent.
course they want them killed.
Okay, you asked me about intent, and the reason that I bought in the South African application is because it is actually exceptionally detailed on intent by quoting
All
numerous,
sorts of idiotic ministers in Israel.
well, yeah, including the prime minister, the defense
the Prime Minister didn't say
the
kill,
chief of
didn't
staff.
say genocide. the chief
No,
of
he said
staff-
Amalek.
According to
He
Asa
said
Kasher,
Amalek.
Use the word
According
Amalek,
to Asa
because the
Kasher-
Hamas are a really
according
evil
to Asa
organization.
Kasher,
If I may.
according to Asa Kasher, the philosopher of the
Asa Kasher,
IDF,
yeah.
he said that Netanyahu
He's
was
just an old
was
Iranian.
avowing genocide.
So-
Now he's an idiot.
So
I
the
didn't say
point,
he's an idiot, but he is
Yeah.
past it.
so the reason I raised the South African application is twofold:
Yeah.
Hamas or no Hamas. It's exceptionally detailed
Okay.
on the question of intent, and secondly, when the International Court of Justice issues a ruling, individual justices have
Can
the
give
right
their
can
own,
give their own opinion.
Yeah, yeah.
And I found the German one to be the most interesting on this specific question, because he was basically saying that he didn't think South Africa presented a persuasive case. But he said their section on intent was so overpowering that he felt he was left with no choice but to vote with the majority. So I think that answers the intent part of your question.
So for the ICJ case that South Africa's brought, I think there's a couple things that need to be mentioned. One is, and I saw you two talk at length about this, the plausibility standard is incredibly low. The only thing we're looking for is a basic presentation of facts that make it conceivable, possible, that
Plausible.
plausible, which legally this is obviously below criminal conviction, below,
Yes, of course.
below.
Think of it as an
it's-
indictment.
Sure, possibly. Maybe even a lower level than even an indictment. So plausibility is an incredibly low standard, number one. Number two, if you actually go through and you read the complaint that South Africa filed, I would say that if you go through the quotes and you even follow through to the source of the quotes, the misrepresentation that South Africa does in their case about all of these horrendous quotes, in my opinion, borders on criminal.
Well, 16 ICJ judges disagree.
That's
with you.
fine if 16 ICJ judges disagree,
They must
but
be
I'm going to
awful
give,
incompetent.
they could be,
They
but
must be even the American judge. She must have been awful incompetent if she was unable to see the misrepresentations that Mr. Bonnell, based on his Wikipedia entry, was able to find.
so this is based on the official ICJ report that was
Yeah,
released. I'm not
I
sure if you
read
read
it.
the entire
I
thing or not.
read
Okay, that's
every
great. Did you
aspect.
go through and actually identify any of the sources for the underlying quotes?
Actually, brace yourself for this, and Mouin could confirm it.
Mhm.
Yaniv Kogan, an Israeli, and Jamie Stern Weiner, half Israeli, they checked every single quote in the Hebrew original. And Yaniv Kogan, loved the guy. He has terrifying powers of concentration. He checked every single quote. Is that correct, Mouin? And Jamie checked every single quote in the English, in the context. And where there were any contextual questions, they told us.
I think they found one.
Yeah, I think they found one. So I do not believe that those 15 judges, it was 15-2.
16-2, I think.
They're 15 on the court plus 2, so it's 17, so it's 15-2. I don't think those 15 judges were incompetent, and I certainly don't believe the president of the court, an American, would allow herself to be duped.
Okay.
Because
well, let me read.
You might recall, Mr. Burrell. Mr. Burrell.
I want to read one.
Let him read.
Sure. So this was taken from the South African complaint. There's tons of these, but so here's one. In the complaint for the ICJ, they said that on the 12th of October, 2023, President Isaac Herzog made clear that Israel was not distinguishing between militants and civilians in Gaza, stating in a press conference to foreign media in relation to Palestinians in Gaza, over 1 million of whom are children, quote, "It's an entire nation out there that is responsible.
Yeah.
It is not true, this rhetoric about civilians not aware, not involved.
I saw that.
It's absolutely not true, and we will fight until we break their backbone," end quote. If you actually go to the news article that they even link it in their complaint, the full context for the quote was, quote, "It is an entire nation out there that is responsible. It's not true, this rhetoric about civilians not being aware, not involved. It's absolutely not true. They could have risen up. They could have fought against that evil regime, which took over Gaza in a coup d'etat. But we are at war. We are defending our homes. We are protecting our homes. That's the truth. And when a nation protects its home, it fights, and we will fight until we break their backbone." He acknowledged that many Gazans had nothing to do with Hamas, but was adamant that others did. Quote, "I agree. There are many innocent Palestinians who don't agree with this, but you have a missile in your goddamn kitchen and you want to shoot it at me. Am I allowed to defend myself? We have to defend ourselves. We have the right to do so. This is not the same as saying there's no distinction between militants and civilians in Gaza." His statement here is actually fully compliant with international law to the letter, because if you are storing military supplies in civilian areas, these things become military targets and you're allowed to do proportionality assessments afterwards. So if this is supposed to be one of many quotes that they've shown that is supposed to demonstrate genocidal intent, but it is very easily explained by military intent or by a conflict between two parties.
I saw that press conference.
Wait, let me just say something. All of this talk is a bit irrelevant because it may sound to the listeners that the court in The Hague has ruled that Israel is committing genocide.
No, I think
but it hasn't.
no.
It just is going in the next few years to look at the whole subject.
Okay.
There has
we're
been
agreed on
no
that.
determination at all.
Fine.
And as Stephen says, some of the quotes are not exactly accurate quotes or taken out of
Total
context.
mischaracterization.
Yes.
Okay. It is correct, as Mouin put it, that it'll be several years before the court makes a determination.
And my guess is that it will determine there was no genocide.
We can
only
That's
guess.
my guess. Yes, no, I'm just giving you my guess.
I can't predict. I got it all wrong, actually, as Mouin will attest. I got it all wrong the first time. I never thought the American judge would vote in favor of plausibility.
So you admit that you were wrong.
Yeah, of course. I think I tell Mouin twice a day, I was wrong about this and I was wrong about that. I'm not wrong about the facts. I try not to be, but my speculations, they can be wrong. Okay, leaving that aside. First of all, as Mouin pointed out, there's a difference between the legal decision by the ruling and an independent judgment. Now, South Africa was not filing a frivolous case. That was 84 pages. It was single.
Even 84 pages can be frivolous.
It takes an hour and a half to read. It was not a massive case.
It was single-spaced, and it had literally hundreds of footnotes.
It can still be frivolous.
It's possible.
Of course,
it
but
could
this
be.
one wasn't.
Yeah, I read the report. To tell you the truth, I followed very closely everything that's been happening to October 7th. I was mesmerized. I couldn't believe the comprehensiveness of that particular report. Number two, there are two quite respected judges, there were two quite respected experts of international law sitting on the South African panel, John Dugard and Vaughan Lowe. Vaughan Lowe, as you might know, he argued the Wall case in 2004 before the International Court of Justice. Now, they were alleging genocide, which in their view means the evidence in their minds, we're not yet at the court, the evidence in their minds compels the conclusion that genocide is being committed. I am willing, because I happen to know Mr. Dugard personally and have corresponded with Von Lowe. I've heard their claim. I've read the report. I would say they make a very strong case. But let's agree plausible. Now, here's a question. If somebody qualifies for an Olympic team, let's say a regional person qualifies for an Olympic team, it doesn't mean they're going to be on the Olympic team. It doesn't mean they're going to win a gold medal, a silver medal, or a bronze medal.
They can swim, that's what you're saying.
No, I would say that's a very high bar.
You're saying they can swim.
To even qualify.
Swim well enough to have a realistic prospect of winning a medal.
So, to even make it to plausible.
That is not true.
Even,
that is not what plausible means.
High,
it is absolutely not. You're dead wrong.
Mr. Borelli, please don't teach me about the English language.
So the Declaration of Judge
I said plausibility is the same concept as qualifying.
The court is not asked at this present phase of the proceedings to determine whether South Africa's allegations of genocide are well-founded. They're not well-founded. They're not even well-founded. The court isn't. You said that plausible was a high standard. It is absolutely not. It is a misrepresentation of the strength of the case against Israel, just like the majority of the quotes they have in this case are. And also, you said it was an extremely well-founded case. They spend like 1/4 of all of the quotations, some even pulled from the Goldstone report, that try to that actually deal with the intent part. Which is, by the way, I think you guys, I don't know if you use the phrase, the dolo specialis, that the intentional part of genocide.
Sorry, I don't know that term.
I think it's called dolo specialis. It is the most important part of genocide, which is proving it is a highly special intent to commit genocide. It's possible that Israel could.
That's mens rea.
Le changement de saison arrive plus vite qu'on pense. Passez aux pneus toute saison pour une adhérence et des performances améliorées. Choisissez parmi les 17 marques de pneus recommandées par Toyota. Vous pouvez compter sur les bons pneus au bon prix grâce à la promesse du meilleur prix de Toyota.
No. The mens rea, yes, I understand the state of mind, but for genocide, it's called dolo specialis. It's a highly special intent. Did you read the case?
Yeah.
It is
Mr.
a highly
Borelli,
special intent.
I'm
going to
ask you again.
Genocide. Yes.
Please stop displaying your imbecility.
Okay, I'm sorry if you think the declaration of the judge is imbecile.
Don't put on public display that you're a moron. At least have the self-possession to shut up. Did I read the case?
Putting my display on camera. If you're comfortable putting yours in books.
Borelli, okay? I read the case around 4 times. I read all of the majority opinion, the declarations. I read Aaron Barak's declaration.
Then why are you lying and saying plausible is a high standard?
Because I said, even reaching the benchmark of plausibility is a very high standard in the world. It's the equivalent of a regional player qualifying for an Olympics. It's still 2 steps removed. You may not be on the team and you may not get a medal, but to get qualified, which in this context is the equivalent of plausible, you must be doing something pretty horrible. As it happens, Professor Morris,
there was no genocide. That's what the court will rule. Remember what I just told you. The court will
I don't
rule
expect to be even around when the court reaches its final decision. Why? It'll take a long, long time.
2 years, 3 years.
No, I don't think it'll take 2 or 3 years.
I mean, Bosnia, which was admittedly a special type of case because they were accusing Serbia of sponsoring the Bosnian Serbs. That took, I think, 17 years from 90.
I assume they'll take 2 or 3 years.
But the point you're making, so this
I'm
is
saying
illegal.
That something horrible must be happening to even achieve.
It is horrible. It's a war.
Yeah,
it's true.
It's horrible.
But I think
they weren't rendering a ruling on a war. They were rendering a ruling on a genocide.
And I think the suggestion.
And they said it was plausible. They also said it was plausible that Israel is committing a military operation as well.
Yeah, but I think the problem with your characterization is you're saying in so many words the South Africans basically only have to show up in court with a coherent statement.
Right.
That is correct.
In today's atmosphere, that's probably correct.
They needed to do a lot more. They needed to persuade.
Today's atmosphere.
The American judge.
They needed to persuade.
Judges go according to what the majority want to hear.
Yeah, but they needed
president.
They needed to persuade the court that it was worth investing several years of their time in
They're probably
hearing
well
this
paid for
case
it,
to us.
so
They're well paid whether
they
they
have
take
time
this
for it.
case or not. I mean, you know, they have a full docket whether they accept or reject this case. And I don't think we should
Remember what I just said. They won't rule there was genocide. Remember what I said.
Also, I recommend people actually read the case and follow through a lot of the quotes. That they just
Okay.
don't show
Mr.
genocidal intent.
Borelli,
I
brace
don't think so
yourself.
either.
The Israeli Minister of
Mr.
Finance on the
Borelli.
8th of October, 2023. This is taken from the ICJ. This is from South Africa's submission. Bezalel Smotrich, I can't read this, stated,
Smotrich.
there you go. Okay, at a meeting of the Israeli cabinet that, quote, we need to deal a blow that hasn't been seen in 50 years and take down Gaza, end quote. But again, if you click through and you read the source, their own linked source, it says, as per this own source, quote, the powerful finance minister, settler leader Bezalel Smotrich, I can't pronounce this, demanded at the cabinet meeting late Saturday that the army, quote, hit Hamas brutally and not take the matter of the captives into significant consideration, end quote. Quote, in war, as in war, you have to be brutal, end quote. He was quoted as saying, quote, we need to deal a blow that hasn't been seen in 50 years and take down Gaza, end quote. You can't strip the quotation of Hamas, a entity that you're at war with, and then pretend that there's genocidal intent. That's not how it.
That's not genocide.
So when the Ukrainians say we need to defeat Russia,
that's not genocidal.
no. When Ukraine says we need to defeat Russia, is that genocidal? Do they mean killing all Russian citizens?
Professor Morris, here's another one. When the defense, ridiculous.
Yes, ridiculous.
The American judge.
He also doesn't determine policy.
The American judge read.
You are holding the American judge to
Well, she was the president.
Because he'll appeal to authority when it agrees with him, and we won't deal with the actual facts of the matter, ever.
Okay. The American judge read several of the quotes.
Look at the American Supreme Court today. They may support Trump.
Look,
shows you how worthy American judges
Professor Morris, without going too far afield, if you heard a statement by the defense minister said, we are going to prevent any food, water, fuel, or electricity from entering Gaza.
Do that? Did Israel do that?
Okay, no, I'm wondering.
What he said.
I'm asking you.
Isn't Israeli government policy?
But we're talking about statements now, intent. How would you interpret that?
After 1,200 of your citizens are murdered the way they were, I would expect extreme statements by lots of politicians.
But you're
by lots of politicians.
But you don't accept extreme
But that's not
Palestinian
Israeli policy.
Wait, but you don't accept.
What he said isn't Israeli policy.
But you don't.
They let in water. They let in gas.
Untrue.
But you don't accept.
electricity.
But you don't accept extreme
Untrue.
Palestinian statements after they lost their entire country, not just 1,200 people.
That's a good point. No, it's a good point.
And on that, on that brief moment of agreement, let's just take a quick pause. We need a smoke break, we need a water break, we need a bathroom break.
Take down Gaza is not a genocide.
I don't know
Defeat
what it
Russia
means.
is a genocidal
What does
statement.
take down Gaza
When we went to
mean?
war with Iraq and we wanted to destroy Iraq, that was a
Take down
genocidal
Gaza.
statement. There's a reason why genocide is such an importantly guarded concept, and it's not to condemn every nation that goes to war.
Mr. Bonnell,
Wait, you do know how to pronounce my name. Are you mispronouncing it intentionally?
He made you into an Italian all the time.
by your solicitude for international law.
You should try learning it sometime. It would help you sort out a lot of the civilian deaths.
Unfortunately, 15 judges disagree.
You could keep citing the judges. You should actually try reading the actual statement.